Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're asking, what was the deal after the freeing of those 4 French hostages, employees of the French nuclear giant Areva, who were for 3 years held captive by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. With us to talk about it, Emmanuel DUPUY of the Institute for Prospective and Security Studies in Europe. Filmmaker and journalist Michael KIRTLEY is with us. Marion, LISSOT, who's the attorney for the families of one of those freed hostages. Philomène, REMY of France 24. And from London, Imad MESDOUA of the Mintz Group, the risk assessment firm. Thank you for being back with us. Before we continue, though, let's say hello to James Creedon. How are you, sir? It's time for our Media Watch segment. We were mentioning at the outset the front page headline in broadsheet of record Le Monde, talking about a ransom being paid, one that's been denied by the government. This is all over the papers, of course.
That's right. Just a quick run through how this came out in the French media. François, it was Europe 1 Radio first spoke about it last night, that, according to their sources, a ransom was paid. Then Le Monde, saying that they had it from a source close to the operation. A French source said some 20 million was handed over, not directly, but indirectly. Then AFP corroborated that with a source from Niger, saying that it was somewhere between 20 and 25 million. Now, the French state, obviously, again and again saying France does not pay a ransom, and the French state did not pay it through, which has led a lot of people to say, well, was it Areva, the nuclear giant, that actually made the payment on behalf, or maybe via with perhaps secret slush funds, not slush funds. In any case, another report that I thought was quite interesting was from Le Monde, saying that how did this affect the Mali operation back in January? Apparently, according to this report in Le Monde, certain strikes were cancelled in the north of the country for fear that the hostages might actually get struck by that, so that it even had an impact on that operation. Now, I suppose, just for a slightly less detailed look at, or more lighter look at the whole thing, what has happened in the last 3 years? A lot of people saying, well, they were in a state of shock when they arrived at the airport yesterday evening. Obviously, that's understandable on a personal level. From in their private lives, there'll be a lot of readjusting. But even in their public lives, in terms of what's been going on in France, some people being a little bit ironic, saying they might have been shocked to see that François Hollande was the president of France 3 years ago. He was the president of the Regional Council of Corrèze, the ex-Secretary General of the Socialist Party. So that was quite an unexpected turn of events from 3 years ago to now. The Dominique Strauss-Kahn scandal there wasn't even a whiff of it yet. Pope Benedict XVI was still in power. So some people being a little bit ironic and pointing out all the different things that have happened in the last few years, even in tweet form, saying that might explain some of their shock seeing Hollande on the tarmac. Other people talking about football and the fact that Paris Saint-Germain is actually now something resembling a great club, with a lot of people making references to, I suppose, the contrast in terms of strikers and what the investment in Qatar made.
3 years of world history summed up in football transfers.
That's right. So, but I think they might actually just be shocked because of actually what really happened, as opposed to different political events, etc.
All right, James Creedon, many thanks. You mentioned Europe 1 radio station, and in fact, there was this morning the daughters of one of those 7 hostages that are still being held who spoke out. She says that Areva did pay up, and she's angry. Take a listen.
The French Foreign Ministry told me 2 months ago that the government would not pay, but Areva would do it for sure. These are the exact words of the Foreign Ministry. The Foreign Ministry did say that Areva would pay, not the government. Areva is anyway very close to the French government.
The state with a majority stake in that French nuclear giant. Emmanuel DUPUY, first of all, that's an allegation. Is that allegation plausible?
It's plausible when you look in the past. The previous hostages have been freed, not because France has paid, but maybe because their companies have paid. Have in mind the 4 hostages in Cameroon, in the northern part of Cameroon. They were held during several months, and then GDF Suez was very active. I'm not alleging anything. At least Gérard Mestralet made it quite clear that the boss of GDF Suez, that his company would leave no one behind. And what we are hearing this morning is very important, because if that is true, then there is a responsibility of the states. I'm not saying we should pay. Of course, I'm not saying.
Is it semantics, whether it's a private firm that pays or whether it's the French government that's paying for, in the eyes of these hostage takers?
I'm not sure Areva is a real private company, that's for sure. Maybe that can be more assessed with Vinci. That's a first point. Second point, the fact is that the money, there is, again, allegations, you mentioned a certain number of articles, whether or not 20 million or more than 20 million was paid. In the past, we know that the price, quote, of an hostage is between 3.5 million euros and 5 million euros. So you have to have in consideration, and again, this is realpolitik, that the insurgents, which have been defeated after the French operation, are now calling back to our memories that they still are existing in the paysage. And it's very precisely what is been going on and will be going on in the future. But to make it clear, and I will make it in a brief comment, I'm not sure there will not be new hostages.
Imad MESDOUA, your thoughts?
Well, I definitely think that, as the previous guest was saying, that the groups benefit from these kinds of financial payments, these ransom payments, and they'll definitely see them as incentives to carry on doing what they've done in the past.
Now, when we say the money's paid out, Imad, is that money going to the hostage takers or is it going to the middlemen? Where does the money go?
Well, that depends on the types of groups and how they're structured. In this particular case, you'd really have to look at the group structure to understand where that money is going. But on a more general point, I'd say, I think what this incident is going to raise as a major question is, how do we assess now this risk in that region, and how do we respond to these kinds of situations in a coherent and very cohesive way? I think if you have some states that are paying, whether through companies or through their own institutions, these groups, whether they pay those groups when others are not, for example, that can create the kinds of problems that we've seen in the past few months in this region. So some states, as you know probably, Algeria adopts a different stance. It has not paid any kind of ransom money, and for that reason it still has hostages that are still in northern Mali, whereas many Western states have paid some, either through private companies or through institutions, these groups, and have secured the release of these hostages. Michael, what's important, and I'm not making not making a judgment on which policy is best. What I am saying, however, is that there needs to be a sort of coherent way to approach these crises throughout the regions, whether it's Western actors or regional actors.
But Michael Kirtley, we know that French military operations to free hostages have not gone well. In Niger, it was 2 young men killed. In Somalia, it was a French gendarme that was killed in botched rescue efforts. So what do you do?
I think that, well, one thing we also notice is that the French seem to be kidnapped a lot in these particular areas compared to other nationalities, especially in the Sahel. And I think that there's obviously a relationship between the ability or the willingness to pay a ransom and the willingness to kidnap people from that particular nationality. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily an association between the terrorist attack that take place and the willingness to pay ransom. There's two different things. I think that what was just pointed out is that we need to think about what we're going to do next. Haven't we been thinking about that for the last several years, what we're going to do next? We always make a certain decision, and then there are always political implications that come in and make us decide differently. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Hollande was saying that he wouldn't be paying the terrorists. So I think that rather than look at it in terms of what do we do next, I think you have to think about what have we done in the past and how did it work. We haven't, the analysis of what's taken place and where it's led us to this point. I mean, today, think about it this way, just to release these hostages, you had to have Niger, Mali, France, Algeria, and possibly Qatar involved with this negotiation. That's a lot of effort to release 4 hostages and to pay off the terrorists.
And is it new oxygen for the captors if indeed they do receive ransom money?
I think it would be pretty naive to think that they didn't receive ransom money. And I mean, what other incentive would they have? I mean, keep in mind that the French killed the head of ACME, Abu Zaid, not that long ago, and so they don't particularly have the French close to their hearts. So I think that yes, I think there's no doubt that receiving 20 million euros revives the ability for them to carry out further terrorist attacks and further hostage taking, as Emmanuel was alluding to earlier.
And again, in this instance, nobody killed. Several key figures, including a former rebel leader turned government minister, who's now the boss of Areva's project to start building a uranium mine in the north of the country. I'm talking about Mohamed Akote. His name's been mentioned a lot. I don't want to go too much into details of who the middlemen are in this story, but it's quite extraordinary. I
think Mohamed Akote is a very well-known figure in Niger, and I think is worthy of talking about, if for no other reason than to say how complicated the actual ability to deal with hostage takers or with terrorists is. He's from actually two different families, one that's from northern Mali and one that's from northern Niger. He's been in politics in Niger. He's now basically the chairman of the board of the uranium company there of Areva, of a relationship with Areva. So I think that in order for him to actually take part in all of this hostage taking and to take over the lead role, which he was asked to do by the president, he had to maintain contacts with all these different terrorist groups that existed all the way, as Emmanuel was pointing out, from southern Libya to southern Tunisia into Mali. And I think it brings up how closely related and how maybe difficult it is to differentiate between those people from that part of the world, because a lot of this negotiating was taking place with people who formerly belong with, together with people who formerly belong with another Tuareg group of their Ansar Dine, who also were somehow involved with the hostage taking. So rather than go into great detail, the complications are often oiled or fueled or helped by the dealing with people who belong to family groups. And I think Mohamed Akote benefited quite well from the fact that he had maintained
relationships. There was a case in 2011 where I think that there were middlemen who made off with some money and stalled the whole process at that point. Areva, a key part of this story, it speaks tomes, by the way, the country's president is a former engineer of that French company. Besides the mines where the hostages were taken back in 2010, there are plans to start building another mine at Imuraren. That's the one that Mohamed Akote is the project manager for. How will this hostage situation affect relations between France, Areva, because it's like a public-private partnership we seem to be implying with this story, and Niger's government? This is at a time when there are also negotiations underway to review how much money the locals get from the uranium extraction. They feel they're being shortchanged.
It's an old story, and that allows me to add that Mohamed Akote is both a very important Malian figure and both Niger stakeholder. He is the nephew of Manu Dayak, old story. Manu Dayak was the former leader of the Tuareg rebellion in Niger, killed in 1995. And that's important because the security of Areva was assured by a deal which was struck between Manu Dayak's party, RCA, armed rebellion in the 90s, and Areva. And what you mentioned is quite true. François Hollande made it clearer, at least than in the past weeks, that France was going to be very helpful to Mahamadou Issoufou, who needs this because, again, he's facing
President Niger.
Domestic problems inside his country, and he needs this deal to bring money to the country, as you mentioned, which is quite poor. So maybe the counter effect of this operation will be the fact that Issoufou will be strengthened. He won the elections in September 2011. And again, Areva was very hard to negotiate before the crisis. I do think after the liberation of the hostages, it will be another story.
He's got a stronger card to play this time. Marion, LISSOT, you're listening to all of this. Of course, the good news for you is that your client is alive.
Yes, that's the first good news. And Alain Legrand can hold his son in his arms, and still today he wants to have all his answer to his question. So we'll see next step.
If it turns out that Areva did pay, if it turns out that they did pay, do you think that'll change his opinion, that maybe he'll withdraw his lawsuit?
This is two different things.
Two different issues.
They could pay, but also they have responsibilities, and judge will see what will happen.
Okay. We've been talking about the question of where it all leaves the Islamists flushed out of northern Mali last year, especially if that ransom money does make its way into the hands of Hakim.
Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or Hakim, was founded in Algeria in the late 90s as the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat. It was renamed in 2007 after aligning with Al-Qaeda. Hakim's sphere of influence stretches across the southern Sahara, from Mauritania in the west to Chad in the east. Its objective, to create an Islamic state across the entire region. Its enemy, the West, and those who stand with it. The jihadists know their territory well, thousands of square kilometres of uncontrolled desert that prove ideal for training under the radar and carrying out their attacks. Recently, Hakim has received some serious blows. Its jihadists were among the 500 fighters killed during France's intervention in Mali. One of the casualties was a top commander, Abu Zaid. Another leader, Mokhtar Bel Mokhtar, quit the group last year, but with new leaders at the head of its main brigades in the Sahel region, Hakim remains ambitious and continues to mount bloody attacks.
Imad MESDOUA, how is Hakim, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, doing?
Well, I think as your report rightly mentioned, it certainly faced a blow as a result of French intervention in northern Mali. And its militants have had to retreat in a way, only to prepare for other types of attacks. But I think we need to keep in mind that with Hakim, we're playing a long-term game, first of all, and second of all, that we're not dealing with a very homogeneous and clear entity. We're dealing with a whole network of individuals and groups throughout the regions with various subsidiaries and franchises. I call them Al-Qaeda and franchises that are sort of springing up wherever it benefits them. And they target vulnerable areas, vulnerable states. And we're seeing that model replicate itself throughout that entire region that I was talking about at the beginning of the show. And so these are key elements that we need to keep in mind. While if we look strictly through the prism of Mali, then we can obviously say that the groups and the militants that had been operating there have faced obviously some setbacks. But if you look at areas such as Libya and Tunisia, where there are also Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb affiliates, then I don't think you can really talk about a group that's in disarray. You can almost talk about a group that's gaining in strength. And as you mentioned earlier, a key part to fighting Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, in my opinion, will be to depend on local allies in the region that have the networks, that know these groups well, and that have experience in dealing with them.
So, Philomène, it's a game of whack-a-mole, the way Imad was describing it. Mali has been sorted to a certain degree, but now they're over in Libya. And leaning on the locals, is that going to be doable in a place like Mali?
I mean, what was really interesting in what Imad mentioned is the confusion between all those groups, because we know that in Mali there were Hakim, but also the Mujao, the movement for the unicity for the jihad in the West Africa, but also Ansardine, the separatist Tuareg group. And we saw in Kidal, for example, that several people of all those groups, they literally just changed clothes and, pretended to be like just among the population after. That's why it was really hard for the French army and for the Malian army, but it's a long story as well, to go inside Kidal. So now the question is, are they still as well in Mali? I think we can be quite certain that some elements of those Islamist groups are still hiding in Mali, maybe among the population, because we need to remember as well that the people that we found, that the French military found in the caves in the Iforas mountains, they were mainly Malian people. All the heads, almost all the heads of those Islamic groups, they ran away. They ran away before the strikes. So now, as Imad said, it's
that
really...
corroborates what Imad was saying, probably gone off to some
gone
other...
off to South Libya, to Tunisia. It's really hard to say that because they are moving as well in small groups and they are very mobile.
Michael KIRTLEY.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that it's both fastidious in a way and naive to think that because of something that has we can look at it in terms of Mali, or we can look in terms of Niger or Algeria or Libya. That doesn't mean that the groups, the jihadi groups that are working together or in a loose sort of a loose federation are thinking that same way. They see that something goes wrong in one part of the world, they move to somewhere else. They regroup. If we look at it as something happening in Mali, we're not going to make any headway in terms of dealing with the problem.
Have lessons been learned, Emmanuel? Is the West getting better at dealing with?
I'm not sure the West is getting better, but the West is learning to fight against them. That's the first issue. Then the second issue, and which quite rightly mentioned, the fact that we're missing the point. I mean, there was no Malian insurgency, or at least there was a secular Malian insurgency, but it's not the same thing as the one we're speaking about. And it was an Algerian insurgency. All the leaders, from Moujao, from AKMI, from Ansar al-Din, came from Algeria. And I think these movements are facing a sort of contradiction. They need a momentum, they need an agenda and a scene, and at the same time, they also need to seek a safe haven. And so you have to look where that issue is brought up now. It's not Mali anymore, for one reason. There has been election, fairly assessed as transparent, or at least have been able to reunify the country, the North and the South. So they're seeking in an area where there is bad governance, capability of crossing from one border to the other. So we don't have to look very far from that. It's again Libya, south of Libya, Grand Fezzan area. But it is also, and that is a new phenomenon, a very dangerous phenomenon, countries like Tunisia, which were a bit out of that agenda. And of course, we have to assess the fact that Egypt is facing this new problem.
And also Mali hasn't been contained. I mean, people think that Mali, the whole situation is over there. There's still a country that's partly divided. That still has. Yeah. There's still negotiations with the rebellion movement that actually caused this whole thing to begin with, in terms of the recent events. I don't think that we can count out Mali as the next theater for new jihadi terrorism.
But what is certain is that all of you are mentioning is cross-border, vast expanses. The United States has pitched in its own way with the institution in Niger of a drone base. Back in May, France 24's Mark Perlman sat down with Niger's president. He asked Mamadou Issoufou about the U.S. installing that drone base to monitor the Sahara.
I think that the presence of friendly states in Niger is, in the area of intelligence, is a good thing. This presence, without this, we would have been slightly blinded. And so the UAVs you're alluding to enable Niger to anticipate, because Niger has information in due time, enabling it to react.
What do you think about drones, Michael KIRTLEY, in the Sahara?
I think that for the president of Niger to give that kind of imprimatur to an American presence in Niger in such a visible way it shows the realpolitik of the region today, because not that long ago, AFRICOM, which is the American military effort in terms of Africa, was not welcome in most of these countries, especially in Niger, and in much of the rest of West Africa. I think that things are changing, and I think that the president of Niger he's been very good in finding compromises with the values that they thought of before, and I think that the working of the hostage release, the working with the drones, is a proof that Niger that the president is thinking about stabilizing his country and stabilizing his electoral possibilities, as Emmanuel was alluding to, in thinking in very realistic terms.
All right.
And that's the way I look at it. I think that the coming of American drones is just going to fuel much more antagonism on the part of the terrorist groups over time.
All right, we'll look at the short-term and the long-term effects in the days and weeks to come. Michael KIRTLEY, I want to thank you. I want to thank Philomène, REMY. Also want to thank Marion, LISSOT, Emmanuel DUPUY, and Imad MESDOUA for joining us from London. Thank you for being with us here for the France 24 debate.